I wanted everybody to feel there was a real sense of authenticity on the set. And I was constantly saying to myself, get these words, get that performance, get it in the best way you know how, but let them cast the giant shadows.
I think many people understand that almost any role that Daniel Day-Lewis plays, he goes through a total immersion, and I think this was no exception.
What really made the difference were the contemporary accounts of encounters with Lincoln, their impressions of him. He remained so accessible.
When he arrived to start filming, he was no longer Daniel Day-Lewis. He was President Lincoln. He actually had so absorbed that character to the point that now everything that came forth from him from that point on has remained and been Abraham Lincoln. It's something I've never ever seen before.
I never asked Daniel about his process. I never questioned it. I just received it with tremendous gratitude.
There's a sort of a mythic quality to him, and I think Daniel, I don't know how he did it, but I think he brought that with him, and I think it's a performance of subtlety and humanity that's essential to really making a Lincoln that you believe is Lincoln.
Abolishing slavery by constitutional provision settles the fate for all coming time.
Tony, Daniel, and Stephen formed the narrative as a triumvirate. And I think that this isn't just about one person, Stephen, inviting the collaborators in. It was the way that this actually could be told, was to understand from these three people what they wanted to bring to this story.
With malice toward none, with charity for all. Between the time that we shook hands on it and the time that we began to shoot the film, a full year had elapsed, and I didn't need to know anything more about him after that period of time. I just couldn't wait to start.
Thunder forth, God of War.
That's great.
In many cases when we were casting parts, we were looking in part for people who might have looked like their counterparts, but Sally playing Mary was Stephen's first choice.
Stephen asked me if I'd be Mary, and I literally started to cry and said, oh my God, yes. But the years went by, we had a reading of it, and then Daniel had come on board. And then I thought, now it's not gonna happen for me. I am 10 years older than Daniel. Mary was 10 years younger than Lincoln, but through the incredible generosity of two people, Steven Spielberg and Daniel Day-Lewis, I became Mary. Daniel flew in from Ireland so that he and I could test, and then they both called me and said, will you be Mary? I knew in my interior I was right for it. I'm exactly Mary's height. The difference is that I gained 25 pounds to be Mary.
I enjoyed every moment that I spent in her company, even when we were tearing each other's eyes out. I enjoyed every moment of that because she was real to me.
Don't you threaten me. You do it this time. Lock me away. You'll have to, I swear. If Robert is killed.
I absolutely love what Sally Field does with Mary. You really get this person who is fighting a battle against a lot of inner anguish. She comes across as a really great political wife, and I think she was.
I gather we're working together. The White House and the other house, hatching little plans together.
Why? You're creating a battle.
Oh.
With Sally was an immediate connection, and we were good friends right out of the gate. I hadn't even heard of Elizabeth Keckley before I received the material for the audition. I, of course, read what I could about her. There are a couple of terrific books that have been written specifically on Elizabeth Keckley's relationship with Mrs. Lincoln because they were so close. As soon as I found out the great news that I had the honor of portraying her in this film, then I jumped right in. I took a 2-week road trip and I drove through the parts of Virginia and North Carolina where Elizabeth Keckley lived for the first 25 years, 30 years of her life.
My son died fighting for the Union. For freedom he died. I'm his mother.
Nicolay was Lincoln's private secretary. I wanted to do as much research as I possibly could, and it's a luxury to have 5 or 6 months to prepare. There's so much to learn about this period, and it's endlessly fascinating.
I went up to Brown and I spent a couple days there. I was at the John Hay Library each day and tried to understand who he was for Lincoln and who Lincoln was to him. It's such an amazing time period and such an amazing character that you want to be doing all that research. Once you start, you kind of can't stop. But it's funny, you do all that research, but then you get to set and you're just like, go.
If somebody is open and real and seems to be living and breathing within a scene, that's all you can ever hope for. And that was vitally true of Tommy Lee Jones, who I've not worked with before, but I don't expect to have a day's work that excites me as much as that day did.
I kept asking Tony Kushner over and over again, did Thaddeus Stevens really say that?
The true purpose of the amendment, Mr. Wood, you perfectly named, brainless, obstructive object.
The lines in the movie that he ends up saying, the ones that garner most of the laughs, that are just the real gut punch in the House of Representatives with the arguments raging on, almost everything is what he actually said historically.
I knew that he was a radical Republican in the war. I didn't know much more about him than that. I knew that he was an abolitionist. When Stephen called and asked me to read the screenplay and if I would consider playing the part, I read the screenplay and immediately said yes. I'm just very happy to be part of that very fine undertaking. And I immediately began to look for biographies of Stevens.
Congratulations on your victory, and get out.
When we were talking about the part of Robert Lincoln, it was Daniel Day-Lewis who right away said, I think Joe Gordon-Levitt would be an excellent actor to play my son in the movie.
When they offered me the role, we had a little exchange via text message, which was a delight. He was such a sweet and generous guy with his words. But also, it's a little bizarre to be text messaging with someone that I've idolized for years.
I won't be you, Pa. I can't do that, but I don't want to be nothing.
It's really clear how much everybody cares about this.
It became clear to me that William Bilbo was a sort of combination of different people. A lot of the department heads were happy for that because unlike a lot of the other characters, it gave them a tremendous amount of freedom in terms of what he could look like. So the makeup and hair department was very excited and the costume department was very excited because it gave them license to be able to have a lot more fun with what his appearance was like. I have more costume changes in the film than anyone else, including Mary Todd Lincoln. We were sort of neck and neck for a while, Mary and I, but I think I've surpassed her.
W.M. Bilbo. Yeah, Mr. Bilbo. Gentlemen. Sir.
It's been really exciting to be part of a trio. It's been great figuring out what each of our roles is within a given scene.
I have explained to Mr. Bilbo and Mr. Latham that we're offering patronage jobs to the Dems who vote yes.
I think there's humor written for all three of us, though.
Should we get to work?
This is a cast of 150, and David Strathairn plays Secretary of State William Seward, Lincoln's right-hand man.
He wrote home once to his wife and said, Lincoln, he is the best of us. The relationship between Seward and Lincoln was one of deep respect, but they were very, very different in the way they worked politically.
That's Preston Blair. Can I call on him?
God help you.
We knew that we were going to get Hal Holbrook to play Preston Blair. We just couldn't imagine anybody better. Hal Holbrook's career as an actor speaks volumes. He's always playing such magnificent characters, and it's also kind of remarkable that today he's still doing Mark Twain on stage.
I've done a tremendous amount of research on Abraham Lincoln because I actually played him 4 different times. So watching him create Lincoln has been very interesting. He likes to remain within himself, which all of us respect.
Think of all the boys who'll die if you don't make peace. You must talk with these men.
I intend to, Preston.
There's a lot of us that have been cast out of New York that all know each other and have either worked together or I've admired their work for a long time.
Tommy called it our little repertory company the other day. And that's really what it feels like. But to get a chance to see people like David Costabile, Stephen Spinella, David Warshawski, the list goes on and on and on. These are accomplished performers, artists.
What Tony has given us are the words. They were orators, they were speakers, they were articulate. It's thick with dialogue and discussion, and the characters are full. It's really amazing.
Richmond was the seat of the Confederacy. It was the capital city of the Confederacy. It was the city in which the President of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis, resided and ran the war through General Lee. We went there for many reasons, one of which was Governor McDonnell gave us basically the key to the city and made it very easy for us to come there and tell the story. It was also a nice feeling of healing to be able to tell the story at the heart of the former Confederacy, where everybody came together.
I think it was 2002 that I first heard about the movie that Stephen wanted to make about Lincoln. So the first thing I did was actually go off and scout locations for battles. Virginia is the place where most of the battles actually took place, especially in the beginning of the war, because it was really a battle between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia.
We began a dialogue with the Film Commission and talking with the government officials, and that's when we found out that there was a period of time when they would not be using the government buildings, and we could go in for a certain period of time and actually access the space, which was really great.
And action.
Much of what existed there was very similar to what existed at the time that Lincoln served.
This State House, when you first look at it from certain angles, is amazingly reminiscent of what it is to be near the White House. This is the state capitol in Richmond. The building was designed by Thomas Jefferson, and what we're doing is in this north face area here, we're going to create the portico of the White House, and it's amazing how much it actually looks like the White House once you put this in here. And then within it is this chamber of the House of Representatives that you can shoot. And they offered us carte blanche to come and shoot this whole area, of which there's many buildings, including the governor's mansion, where we can actually go in and use them almost as is. So that was very, very inviting, not just from a pragmatic financial standpoint, but also I felt a soulful point of view. You can go to Jefferson Davis's house and it's still dressed the way it was when he lived there. There are mansions that are still very much as they were in the Civil War era. Petersburg itself is an old town that part of it really just looks the way it did back then.
Richmond, Virginia was amazing. It's a beautiful city. It's got great period architecture. The city welcomed us in a way that very few cities welcomed us before. And it was good to be there to film on locations that were part of the true events.
It was such an honor to be here on the first day when Steven Spielberg actually walked onto Capitol Square here and was able to kind of look around and say basically, well, this is a backlot. It's just been an amazing experience to watch the art department transform this space at Capitol Square into 1865 Washington.
We were in the South. We were in a place we were talking about. We were in a vitally important part of the Civil War.
I believe the significance of the film being set here in Virginia, and in particular Richmond, Virginia, is authenticity. It just really gives a very broad palette to capture every bit of the story, all here in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Lincoln couldn't have been happier at the idea that a movie has been so warmly embraced by the city of Richmond. It's perfect, but on a larger scale, this city, the capital of Virginia, the most important state in the Confederacy, has embraced a movie about Abraham Lincoln.
I'd like your states restored to their practical relations with the Union immediately.
Mainly, I think Stephen and I realized that you can't rush the cuts. You had to let somebody look. I like the eyes looking at each other. I love that when people looking at each other, they feel it. if Lincoln would say something, I'd hold on him, and he looks. And then we go to the Confederate vice president, he's looking. So we didn't rush it. We gave people time to think about what they're seeing, and it was the way to work. It's not an action picture.
Scenes play for long periods of time in one angle. I just wanted the scenes to exist in seemingly real time. And if I had gotten too fancy with too many reaction shots and too many cutaways, I think it would have taken away. It would have drawn the attention away from some very complicated political points that Lincoln was trying to make.
I use the law allowing for the seizure of property in a war, knowing it applies only to the property of governments and citizens of belligerent nations. But the South ain't a nation. That's why I can't negotiate with them.
So I needed the audience to lean forward, to pay utter attention to what was being said. And in order to do that, I didn't get fancy with the scissors or with the lens.
James Brooks, Nate.
This was not something that required John Williams' music to necessarily set the pace of the drama. It needed to support the gravitas of what was being talked about. It was a very subtle job of scoring this movie.
I have been very familiar with Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, but in thinking about writing the music for Lincoln, my first thought was that perhaps all the music should be only music that Lincoln had heard in his life. We know quite a bit, but I didn't think enough, at least for my purposes. And so this led me to conclude that in order for me to find what I needed for this particular scene or that particular scene, that I had to make it myself. I can't speak for Stephen, certainly, but I would guess that this particular project, Lincoln, was viewed by him as a great responsibility and a daunting challenge, very different than making a straightforward entertainment film, Raiders of the Lost Ark. So for me, it was very different from my experiences with Stephen's movies in the past years. For quite a number of years now, I've been conducting the Chicago Symphony periodically, and everybody in the music world knows that Chicago Symphony is one of our greatest orchestras in the country and certainly one of the best in the world. And every time I would come back from Chicago, I'd say, Stephen, that's the greatest orchestra in Chicago. Someday we should do something with them, never really thinking that would be practical. And as we approached the time to make decisions about where, when, and how to do Lincoln, I think Stephen said, wouldn't it be a great time to have your friends now at the Chicago Symphony perform? So we recorded at Symphony Hall in Chicago, and the performances are extraordinary, actually, personal and of very, very high artistic quality. And the recording in Symphony Hall is very successful, has a beautiful low end. I don't know if people watching this film think about these kinds of things, but the bass response in the orchestral recordings is particularly good. And it was wonderful that we were in Illinois with the orchestra, because Illinois was the first state to ratify the 13th Amendment. So I thought that was a very nice spiritual connection.
Stephen cautioned me that this was not similar to previous projects we'd worked on. Most of what I had been connected with, the Indiana Jones films, for instance, were loud, bombastic movies full of flame and fire and fights. And this was going to be very different, he said.
As a sound guy, you think, okay, we're going to have Lincoln's going to be some Civil War battles and fighting, and the superficial sound guy part of even Ben Burtt probably thought the same thing. The more battles, the better. Really, the only battle in the movie is the first scene. It's hand-to-hand combat, the opening battle. So yeah, the real sounds of battle exist for a little bit. We get our sound guy glory of fighting and punches and sloshing in mud. Then we never have that kind of sound again. And then from then on, yeah, the soundtrack is full of clock ticks. And clock ticks in this movie thematically work because you get the sense of history and time weighing down on the president because there's this civil war going on, and he has to make decisions, and how does he deal with things, and there's kind of a weight to his dealing with these issues. And something about clocks, especially old clocks, feel like there's a weight.
There's no recordings of the period at that time. Audio recording really wasn't invented until about 10 years after Lincoln was assassinated, but I thought that perhaps there would be artifacts in museums or in collections around the country that might have objects that Lincoln actually heard in his life. And so I set about researching where are things that Lincoln actually heard. And it led down many interesting paths. But I very much wanted to get the sound of one of his watches ticking. And that led me to search out the existence of his watches. There's a few of them still around. The Smithsonian has one. I contacted them. And there was a great deal of discussion took place about could the watch be wound up, and if so, would it work or would it get damaged and this sort of thing. And after a few months of thinking about that, the Smithsonian decided that it was just too risky to handle that watch that they had. I was a bit disappointed. But I found another watch, which actually turned out to be even better because it's the watch that Lincoln had in his pocket when he went to Ford's Theater. And there's no way to absolutely prove that, but this was a watch given to Robert Lincoln after his father's assassination and was held by him for many years, given to a friend, and found its way into the Kentucky Historical Society just a few years ago. They had never wound it up to see if it functioned. And they brought a watchsmith out, and they carefully wound it up, and by golly, there it was, ticking away. And so I sent Greg Smith, one of my recording partners, there to Kentucky to record the watch. And they let Greg record it from the front, from the back. They opened the watch up, and he put a little tiny mic inside the watch, so we got it from every perspective. And when I got those recordings back, it was really a thrill to know that this ticking was the sound that was around every time Lincoln was probably alone in his office. But I also had another objective, which was to record the clock that was in Lincoln's office, his executive office in the White House in 1865, because I read that clock still exists and it's still in the White House. And I made a request, could we come and record the clocks, or specifically a clock in the White House that was there during Lincoln's time. And they graciously invited us to come and do it. And so when Lincoln is alone in his office and they're voting on the 13th Amendment, there's a very nice moment where there's a little ticking of the clock. And then you begin to hear the bells ringing. And historically, that's one of the things that actually happened. And in fact, we went out and recorded the church bells that are there today in Washington within earshot of the White House, the actual bells that Lincoln would have heard, because those bells are still in St. John's Church and in the Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C. And there were cannon emplacements around the city for its defense, but they were instructed to have a victory celebration, a cannonade to celebrate this vote. And so we actually had the clock, we had the right bells, and we had the cannons, which we recorded some live Civil War cannons at Manassas Battlefield, and we could put it all together, so it was very realistic.
You could have heard a pin drop on the set, absolute silence. And Daniel spent all day crooked, bent awkwardly into this bed. He was playing dead. And then it was the end of the day, and Stephen had got what he wanted, it was cut. And then that was the end, and it was so odd. It was the end of the film. Lincoln died, and that was it. And nobody really knew what to do because it was so sad.
It's all over. The president is no more.
Everybody then just started hugging and crying. It was the most peculiar thing. I'd love to hear what everybody else said.
I think that's a common experience that we all have, not just
actors, directors, but anyone that works on films, you're not quite sure what to do with yourself when it's finished. The investment has usually, for most of us, been a close to total investment of that period of our lives in the process of telling that particular story. So it's very hard to conceive of any kind of a life after it. Of course, there is one waiting, usually quite impatiently. But in this particular case, I felt two things at one and the same time. One was a sense of immeasurable privilege at having been enabled to explore that man's life. And the other was a sense of great sadness and loss that that time allowed me was now over. Because he did become, for me, there's never been a human being that I never met that I loved as much as him, ever. I doubt there ever will be.
When it was over, it was over. And I was pretty set adrift, you know, the fact that I wasn't going to be able to come to work with Daniel Day-Lewis. One of the greatest experiences, if not the greatest experience in my professional life. So when Daniel asked for me to come into his trailer, sort of to say goodbye after the last shot, Daniel sat down with his English accent. And he suddenly started talking to me as Daniel, and the tears came down my face, and it was very hard. It was a very tough pill to swallow, because I think he let me down in the only way he could and knew how to do, and he let himself down the same way. He instantly became himself. Of course, I think he was himself with his wife and family, but I only got to see the Abraham Lincoln side of him. And in that sense, I felt I got to know the President of the United States, arguably the greatest President of the United States. It wasn't a game we were playing. It wasn't method acting. It was sincerely, when Daniel came on to the set, he was Abraham Lincoln, not just to me, but to other actors in the scene and to the entire crew. And we all went home feeling a little emptier because we weren't going to really have that proximity any longer.
Every era since Lincoln lived has appropriated him for various political purposes. He remains the ideal of a president. And I think the main relevance, of Lincoln is that it is possible to achieve radical, even revolutionary transformation of society through electoral democracy.
I'd like to get the 13th Amendment through the House and on its way to ratification by the states, wrap the whole slavery thing up forever and aye as soon as I'm able, now, end of this month. And I'd like you to stand behind me like my cabinet's most always done.
Nothing would have mattered more to Lincoln than to know that the Lincoln Memorial has become an iconic place for movements over time. Of course, Martin Luther King and the I Have a Dream speech going there, various movements, anti-war movements, idealistic movements, things taking place. So I think the idea at the end of the movie of knowing that it didn't stop in 1865, but what Lincoln fought for has somehow infused people over time. It's a very moving way to show that the influence of this man and this leader continues on to the present day.
Lincoln exemplifies leadership. I think when you start to read his speeches and you look back at how he conducted himself as president, I think it does make you realize it's difficult for somebody to really do the job that Lincoln did today. And I think that Lincoln had more opportunity than leaders do today to really access the people around him and try to find the right thing to do.
No one's ever been loved so much by the people. You might do anything now. Don't waste that power on an amendment bill that's sure of defeat.
This movie feels very current. And it resonates so enormously on a world level about the difficulty, the messiness, the complicated nature of democracy, and how long it takes to really have it work.
But say all we've done is show the world that democracy isn't chaos. That there is a great invisible strength in a people's union. Say we've shown that a people can endure awful sacrifice and yet cohere. Mightn't that save at least the idea of democracy to aspire to?
Lincoln is relevant to the present because his presidency, I believe, offers the most vivid model of a leader, of leadership. Lincoln advocated things we hold dear today. He advocated that government can be a positive force for the good of all people. He advocated that democracy requires fairness and compassion and education, and it requires a respect for law and racial, ethnic, and religious tolerance. And I've always believed that trying to make sense of what actually happened in the past always helps to shape our present, and that history is always relevant in the sense that understanding how we got to where we are will help figure out where we want to go from here.
We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.